Today's morning coffee vinyl side, Frank Soda and the Imps, Soda Pop, 1980. Welcome to another Vancouver Van-Tastic Vinyl selection, a weekly feature on Morning Coffee Vinyl side where we play and celebrate an album from an artist with a significant Vancouver connection. Frank Soda got his start in BC, and it was on a train out of Vancouver bound for Toronto, with a Gibson SG stashed away in the baggage car, that Frank's musical journey began. Italian-born, Kitimat-raised, and BC road-honed guitarist Frank Soda made his bones on guitar touring the beautiful province of British Columbia in the early 70s. Hooking up with Vancouverite Thor sometime in 1973 after serving as a pickup band at a local Kitimat gig for the gigantic rock and roll warrior, they set forth for Toronto from Vancouver via cross-country rail, full of dreams and plans, determined to conquer the East. Forming Thor and the Imps, with Frank on guitar, John Lechasseur on drums, and Charles Towers on bass, they recorded and released Muscle Rock in 1976 after years of toil, having won over the good people of the eastern provinces through sheer force of will and the reputation of their outrageous stage show. Iron bar bending, brick smashing, hot water bottle blowing up, on-stage chaos through the halo of smoke and light. That was a Thor and the Imps show. It was every manner of musical spectacle and mayhem. Now, Thor would leave the band soon thereafter to pursue opportunities for himself in America, leaving Frank Soda and the Imps in Toronto to continue on their own, with Frank stepping up to the vocal mic. After releasing live material on a Chum FM sponsored album called Live in the Tube in '79, Frank Soda and the Imps signed with Canada's Quality Records and recorded Soda Pop, their first and only studio album with the original Imp lineup in 1980. They would continue to grind into 1981, touring in support of big headlining acts before eventually disbanding, leaving Frank to carry on as a solo artist. But Soda Pop remains as an important artifact in the book of Canadian rock, if ever one is to be written, that captures both the promise and the disappointment that is so common in today's music industry. The story is important, but you won't find it in the numbers. It's not about the album's success or failure in sales. To really understand it, you have to go back in time to the early 70s, when Canada was still waiting to celebrate its centennial. In the early 70s, there were less than 2.5 million people living in BC, with the majority of British Columbia's population, about 3/5, residing well outside of Vancouver's lower mainland in the smaller, more rural areas and resource economy-based towns and municipalities scattered through its vast territory. Concerts, certainly concerts by big national and international acts, were events held only in major urban centers. Television was limited to just a few channels if you could get it, and radio was spotty and very local at best. Even records and tapes were hard to get a hold of in any predictable supply, and if you wanted entertainment or a night out, you went to the local bar and watched one of the many small bands or musical acts that traveled the roads and highways that connected everyone in the province. These unsung and forgotten heroes of yesteryear were the road dogs in traveling minstrel tradition. A tradition dating back to the Middle Ages when companies of actors and troubadours traveled from town to town, village to village, in wagons and caravans, performing for coin and supper. As the 70s progressed, and the spectacle and legend of big rock shows with fire and explosions swept through culture, the imaginations of young blue-collar adults from these small towns who could only dream of one day getting to the big city to see such a thing were ignited, and of course the imagination of the road dogs too. That's how acts like Thor and Frank Soda and the Imps were born. These guys brought the spectacle of big stadium rock shows to little bars and clubs all across Canada. Their shows were DIY versions of big concert-styled pyro, complete with smoke and fire and explosions, lights, theatrics, and acrobatics, all and every manner of crazy. Shenanigans for sure, violating local codes, ordinances, and bylaws, if there were such things, and usually just avoiding disaster by the seat of their pants. As part of the Imps, Frank Soda became known for his tireless energy, relentless guitar attack, and blowing up a television he'd wear on his head. He soon added other combustible props to the show, all head-mounted, involving fire and smoke and explosions, including a smoking pig and an exploding Marshall combo amp. Whether there were 10 people or 200 in the crowd, the show and performance remained the same. When the Imps went into the studio to record Soda Pop, they left their act outside. Without the literal fire and fury, it became fairly apparent that their material was designed for a different performance medium. They were a band that played to the baying crowd and fed off the energy they received. The studio offered no such reward. The Imps had invested so much into being a live act that made them legend. Their songs and arrangements were somewhat underdeveloped and naked outside of that paradigm. Now, if you listen critically, you can hear where these songs were headed, where they might have gone if they'd been written with radio in mind. You can also hear, particularly if you're a musician, elements within the music that are there specifically because they would have worked well live. And here's where that really hurt them. Because the drinking age in Canada was 18 or 19, bands like Frank Soda and the Imps rarely got to play for young audiences. The elusive all-ages shows were just not a thing back then. Rock audiences in the bars and clubs of Canada in the 70s were adult audiences. But as the 80s began, the music industry started shifting towards the tastes of a younger demographic. Their tastes were driving sales, and all they had was radio to judge a band. Soda Pop, as an album, just didn't punch its way into their consciousness. As fun as it is, it was outclassed by slicker acts with slicker production and bigger budgets behind them. And by the time video became a thing, old road dogs like Frank and the Imps just didn't have the same appeal. Those old school DIY stage spectacles just didn't impress the 80s kids in the same way. They had access to bigger and better through television and through live concerts and more big-name acts touring and playing in Canada. I went to my first concert in 1984 as a 14-year-old, Van Halen at the Pacific Coliseum in Vancouver. My second concert was Michael Jackson on the Jackson's Victory Tour that same year. In 1985, I saw Ronnie James Dio slay a mechanical dragon on stage with a young Yngwie J. Malmsteen and Rising Force opening up for him. Those were spectacles. But I love the idea of this album. I love what it represents, for what it's missing but readily apparent in its negative spaces. The dream and the mission to bring the rock to the people. These guys were heroes, every last one of them. And as our memories fade and we chase after the latest shiny thing, it's artifacts like this album, and a few old video clips that we'll have to help us piece our history back together. Now, for a big surprise, this album is available on the streaming services, and I've been playing it a lot. But when I play it, I can't help but imagine what it would have been like to see these guys in 1979 in some rock club in some northern Ontario town, seeing Frank jumping around and blowing stuff up off his head. Frank came back to Vancouver and has been resident here in the burbs since the late 80s, raising a family, writing songs, occasionally gigging. He's pursued lots of smaller projects, forming new bands, even performing with his wife, playing with old friends. He never left the industry. So I say this, salut. Salut to Frank, salut to the Imps, salut to all the BC boys and girls with big rock and roll dreams that made life in the 70s a little more tolerable for all those living in the blue-collar towns and villages across the country. May they never be forgotten.